All right, I'm excited for my next speaker. We have Kacper Koziol, Institutional Solutions Lead at Amish Protocol. He's going to be talking about compliant cross-chain lending with ZK pre-checks. Really excited. Please welcome Kacper.
Hello, everybody. So let's begin. My name is Kacper. I'm the co-founder of Herodotus. I'm the institutional solutions lead at Amish Protocol, where we're working on a new type of lending on Ethereum. And today, the title of my talk is essentially Compliant Cross-Chain Lending with ZK Pre-Checks. And I'll dive deeper into this in a moment. So before we begin, we need some background context. And we're going to go look at the big picture over here. So in the TradFi world, the playbook is flipped. So historically in TradFi, institutions have always had deep access to deeper liquidity, better tooling, better networks, better connections, and so on. And although in recent years, we've seen a lot of rise of neobanks and so on, trying to give access to this, the things that they've already had access to for the many, many, many years back, it's only now that that's happening. And essentially, DeFi became too big to ignore, where it became something that these institutions now want to basically participate in. They want to become members of this marketplace, of this economy. And so far, this has been happening through permission forks and permissioned layer 2s, layer 1s, and so on, where they have control over the criteria, the compliance rule sets, and so on that are imposed onto them by their respective regulators. And yep, that's basically been the response of the industry. And what they got so far is, through these permission forks, is essentially they got the technology stack. They got access to automation of things that normally they would have basically been doing manually within their organizations. They got access to the smart contract infrastructure, the settlement mechanics. But the key factors that have been left out of this are essentially access to unified liquidity, market depth, competitive rates, and broad participation. Basically the definition of an open economy. So I have a quote here that says, you can fork a repo in 5 minutes. Honestly, these days with an LLM of your choice, you can probably do that much faster. But you can't fork the liquidity itself. And looking at this drives me to basically introduce Amish lending. So the traditional form of lending in DeFi is through pools. Amish does things differently. So essentially, Amish lending is an intent-based order book. We have per market pairs, and participants sign intents of what they intend to, what kind of position they intend to basically enter into. We have an off-chain matching engine that finds counterparties whose terms overlap. So as in any market, you got buyers and sellers. In lending, we have lenders and borrowers. From the perspective of Amish, in the lending markets, as a lender, when you're onboarded, you basically are able to provide a clear overview of what your individual risk parameters are, what assets you accept as collateral, what assets you are willing to provide, what rates you're willing to provide, what LTVs you're comfortable with for those asset pairs, what durations of loans are you comfortable with, as well as any other arbitrary criteria that you can come up with. As a borrower, the user experience is pretty simple. You go on a website, and you basically connect your wallet, and you see exactly what assets you have across all the various chains that you deployed capital on. And you're able to basically check mark exactly which ones you want to be able to use as collateral. Then you basically put inside like a box of what do I want? let's say I want 100 USDC on Arbitrum. I click submit. This is an intent. I showcase the intent of what I want and where I want it. This intent is sent to a backend with a signature, and basically the backend checks if there's any overlap between what this user wants and whether there's any overlap with what any of the existing lenders have or are willing to provide. If there is any overlap, a trade is executed. So it's essentially peer-to-peer with fractional fills. We have isolated risk, which is a big benefit compared to the traditional pool model. This unlocks access to things like exotics, long-tail assets, and so on. And you have fixed terms that match, which are optional, but you would be able to have like variable terms as well. So what are Sentinel pre-checks? This is the modern solution to this, to unlock institutions to participate on public permissionless blockchains. We're able to combine intents and pre-check criteria inside this protocol. So with Sentinels, intents carry cryptographic pre-check criteria alongside the standard parameters. So the standard parameters are things like collateral, principal, LTV, APR, duration, and which chain you're on. But we're able to add additional criteria, which is specific to one of these counterparties. So for example, one of these pre-checks can be something like sanctions. Hey, I want to make sure my specific account is not a member of this set, of this data set. And we're able to do that by verifying proof of non-inclusion inside an off-chain accumulator. So we have like an off-chain accumulator that's basically growing everyone that's a member of that set, and we verify that you're not a member of that set. We can also have pre-checks for things like KYC. I want to make sure that you are a member of that set, that you have completed KYC with some sort of provider, that maybe you have an NFT that represents that, and that's the proof. Next, another example is something like risk scoring. So you can have a module that calculates a numerical risk score that can take into account various factors and ensure that you're above some sort of threshold. All of these together, we can verify these accumulator routes on-chain before match execution. Why is this critical? Is because if you don't fulfill the criteria, your transaction reverts. It never enters the protocol. It never becomes a protocol's problem, which is very powerful. So this introduces a new concept of something we call visible but inaccessible liquidity. So far when you have like permission forks of various different DeFi protocols, all of them basically start from scratch. They have to build up their own network effects, market participants, attract them in various manners. But with this unified order book approach, essentially what we have is we have a unified order book where everyone submits orders to the same order book. However, you provide pre-checks for the criteria that is specific to you, not the counterparty. It could pertain to the counterparty, but you're in a specific jurisdiction. You have specific criteria that you need to follow, and that is included as part of your intent. And if there is overlap that matches that, your order is executed. If there's not, then it basically is not. And the terms at which you're basically matched have to be basically available inside this order book. So the order book is shared, the fulfillment is selective. This introduces a very significant incentive shift where additional constraints that may exist beyond the compliance baseline, which we're going to define as something that's like fundamentally important and necessary to include. In this diagram over here, you have this shown as like sanctions and KYC. We'll include that as like a baseline. Anything above that, that's additional. So for example, like scoping by region, risk scoring, some sort of other exposure criteria, some sort of whitelist, a jurisdiction like scope. They continue to restrict the size of the set that's available inside that order book. But the order book itself is unified, and the order book is cross-chain. The order book represents intents that are aggregated from the whole Ethereum ecosystem. So reducing constraints essentially unlocks new liquidity. So what's behind the root? So there's two types of accumulators we have. We have trusted accumulators and provable accumulators. Trusted ones are essentially managed by a centralized or external party. Humans or like corporations maintain the data. Some sort of centralized actor maintains the data. And enforcement is cryptographic via like Merkle proofs, but these are inclusion proofs based off the data they provide you. So these can be things like government sanctions lists, KYC attestations, institutions' own approved list of who they want to collaborate with. You could have a peer-to-peer relationship inside this kind of like marketplace where like you have a unified order book and you're like, I want to participate with this specific counterparty. You basically add them as a specific like counterparty you only want to execute trades against. You could also have internal blacklists of non-inclusion. I was like, I want to make sure I never interact with these folks. Next, you have provable accumulators. And this is something at Herodotus we've been working on with our ZK coprocessor, where we can off-chain construct accumulators that are built using a predefined, pre-committed criteria. So you could have multiple actors that construct the same accumulators off-chain and then prove that these accumulators have been constructed correctly, and then you just post those roots on-chain. So what would be the scope of something like this? So for example, if I ever wanted to prove like everyone that historically has interacted with Tornado Cash, I can do that. I can prove that like everyone that has ever like held an NFT or like currently holds an NFT, I could construct this accumulator, which is essentially like just a data structure off-chain. Things like rolling volume. So I could have an accumulator that as every single block is produced, we have like a running balance of what is the volume that account has done in the last 24 hours. So keeping them current can be done off-chain. You basically post those roots of like what's the latest status on-chain based on your like use case requirements. And so on. So both of these basically produce a root. They have different security properties, but the pre-check mechanism is essentially the same for both. Yeah, so here's some pseudocode. Essentially, just to give you intuition of what it looks like from a smart contract developer. If you're a smart contract developer and you have some sort of like criteria that you want to basically enforce, you would basically do like a pre-check. You would basically put who the counterparty you're trying to interact with is. You would put the roots of the accumulator that you're trying to verify criteria against, as well as a proof. So this could be like a Merkle proof against an off-chain data structure that you've generated. And then you basically require them to basically fulfill that requirement. So inside Amish lending, essentially what we'd be able to do is be able to provide institutions with a way to participate, engage with each other on public permissionless blockchains without having to basically launch their own instances of such. So a Sentinel pre-check, it fires up before any state changes. If you don't fulfill the criteria, it simply reverts. It never becomes a part of the state. You verify Merkle proof to the root. If it fails, there's a revert. There's no side effects. Criteria can be arbitrary. You can have counterparty identity, volume, risk, market volatility bounds. Portable, and any protocol with a transaction boundary can integrate this. What's the outcome of this? Open economy. So essentially what this allows us to do is it allows us to have institutions to participate and tap into a unified liquidity set. I don't want to say liquidity pool because it's essentially a unified order book. On a public permissionless blockchain while fulfilling the criteria that's required by them by their jurisdiction of operation. So historically, we've had protocols that basically define their own rule set and deploy their own instances. And they've always been accustoming the whole protocol to their requirements. Here we kind of like turn tables where you as a participant impose those requirements onto yourself, and the protocol itself remains permissionless. And this is very, very, very powerful because it has this self-restricting factor where, like, over time, it incentivizes, like, decreasing the amount of constraints that are imposed on you, because that unlocks more liquidity, larger market access. while still remaining compliant to the jurisdiction that's specific to you. So constraints enforced at a transaction level with a shared public market without fragmenting it for anyone else. So the three main takeaways of this talk are compliant constraints are real. So market fragmentation to enforce them is a regression. Solving that as a transaction level preserves the thing that makes public DeFi valuable. Number two, the accumulator framework supports both trusted and provable data sources. Sanctioned lists, KYC attestation, on-chain behavioral data, internal whitelists, all produce roots, all feed the same pre-check mechanism. Three, the Sentinel pre-check calls pattern is portable and criteria can be arbitrary. Identity, risk parameters, market conditions, anything representable as an accumulator. This is infrastructure. So I'm going to leave you with this quote. Essentially, compliance is non-negotiable. It's going to exist either way. But fragmenting markets to enforce it is a choice. And at Amish Market Lending Protocol, we're essentially trying to basically make this division of what we're trying to build. So thank you, everyone, for listening. And I'll be around to answer any questions.